and welcome back to our second half, and we're going to focus today on page number 12, which we call Barrier 1, Breaking Through Fear. Also, too, if you have the 4 Barriers to Quality book, it's also, this stuff's cross-referenced in that, and that's in chapter 1. So if you look at the face of fear, it's really kind of interesting when we started looking at this and how to put all these things down that were happening internally within the organization. I said, well, first of all, we really need to look at and identify what fear looks like. And that's what you'll see the way we've done with all the barriers in the program. But what we're saying is very important to understand and get an awareness of what fear looks like. So what we're going to do is that we're going to talk about the face of fear. We're going to then address how do we address the fear, and then we're going to see the results. So what we're going to do now is start with the open door policy. Now, out there, every organization I go to, all the folks go, I got an open door policy. Well, it's really kind of interesting is that when there's fear in an organization, you've got really everything but an open door policy, and we call that the perceived open door policy. And how that kind of evolved is that in one of our organizations years ago, we had the owner, CEO of an organization, a problem kind of came up and it cost us a lot of money. And so what was frustrating, as what we had said earlier, that by the time that the problem surfaces, gets to either human resource or their boss or the owner or the CEO or president of the organization, it's already exploded, and it's usually about 6 months after it happened. So it was interesting when we came, and that particular deal cost us about $20,000, and we're sitting in there, and that owner of that organization, we had about 900 employees in there, stands up and goes, why didn't somebody tell me I have an open door policy? In his heart, he believed that he had an open door policy, and he sincerely wants an open door policy, and most of us do. But when there's fear in an organization, what I've come to realize is that the person, no matter where they're at in the level in the organization, none of them really have a problem talking to a few levels up from their immediate supervisor, but because of the contact internally, daily, with their immediate supervisor, boss, or department head, or whatever you want to call it, there seems to be a little more fear than with the guy at the top. Because what's interesting, I've seen the guy at the top just wants to do the deal. His problem is he's never had a system to do the deal, no matter what it is internally within the organization. So the open door policy, that's almost like, how many of y'all have the suggestion boxes? Well, that's real interesting. When's the last time you went in there and looked at it? And what you'll find, in fact, when I go out through the plants in some of these companies, that's where I put my gum at. I open it up and put my gum in there because I know no one's looking at it. And what has happened with the suggestion box is that I did put stuff in there. Either I would come down on, or the fact that the company never acted on it. So I just stopped putting suggestions in. Same thing with the open door policy. The open door policy is, because of fear, I feel very uncomfortable. Or the last time that I went and saw, whether it was my immediate boss or their immediate boss or whatever you want to say it, I got what we call the tar whipped out of me. So what happens now, the open door policy is shut, and I'm sitting here saying, hey, I got an open door policy and I feel it and I want it. Our question back to you is, what are you doing? You've got to get out there and see your people daily, because most of the time we see our people, it's when it's a conflict. Think about that. Most of the time we go out on the floor, go into the office, or go to another division is when there's a problem. We never really go just to say hello. So if you look at the fear, we call that a perceived open door policy. Next, let's look at the fear of expression. I'm going to combine the fear of expression and the fear of action. If you look at this, the fear of expression is because I can't speak up, and I know all of us here have been guilty on both sides. Somebody bring us a problem, and I've been told to bring problems. I've been told to bring solutions. And I love that when they say, well, don't bring me the problem, bring me the solution. Yeah, that sounds good at that seminar we all went to, But when you have fear in an organization, you might as well throw that one out the window. So when you have fear in an organization, the organization starts shutting down. And in that, the communication stops. But what we say is that literally we become what we call head nodders. And that is, you tell me what you want me to hear, and then I'll respond to make sure that I don't create conflict. So then when we have the fear of communication, also brings with it the fear of action. And the fear of action is that I know the solution. I know what I have to do to fix or to put that order or to satisfy that customer. But because of the fear, last time I did that, I was told to either go back and mind my own business, you're not a customer rep, you're a, let's say, a purchase order processor. We were put back into our place. And so depending on the larger the organization, the more in-depth the 4 barriers to quality. The longer the organization has been in business, the more in-depth. That's why it's a lot easier, and what our goal is to get this stuff to where companies start out fresh by focusing and building that infrastructure. When we go into companies, it's really hard because of the fear. People are going to be very close to the vest. And it says, because of fear, holding each other accountable. Now, this is another interesting thing here, is that when there's fear in an organization, I'm not going to hold you accountable, because the last time I held you accountable, you started slowing down my stuff that I needed from you in order to do my job. So what happens is that holding each other accountable, and when there's fear, we don't. We kind of make sure that whatever we're doing, that we're staying within status quo. And if there's an issue or there's a problem, I'm not going to speak up. I'm not going to speak up and say, in some of our companies, we might even have a brother-in-law that's in the company. And I can't hold that accountable because that might make somebody higher up or the owner or my department manager mad at me. And so you're looking at holding each other accountable. We kind of just let it go. Or we attack, which then opens up defending and justifying everything. The hidden agendas, when we're saying there's fear, a hidden agenda, it was kind of interesting. There's not a definition in the dictionary with a hidden agenda, so I had to write my own definition. What we saw is that a hidden agenda really works 2 ways. One is, a hidden agenda is that I'm not coming up to you and telling you exactly what you need to hear, for the fact is that I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. Or if I come up and say something or do something that you're asking, that in effect it's going to put me in an awkward position. And the more fear there is, the more shutdown. So if we're looking at the hidden agendas, this is where, and we'll get to it here in a minute, but when there's the fear, the 1%, what we call the bad employee, run rampant internally. And so the hidden agenda from the negative side of the employee base, the 1% affect 5% with the same negative characteristics that affect 20%. So the hidden agenda is that I'm saying or manipulating my job, my base work center, my product, my service, my coworker, my organization, just for the fact is I want to benefit. We're saying when you're benefiting at the expense of another, that's a hidden agenda. So when there's fear, not only can you not go, basically you can't approach it, because no matter what happens, you get the tar whipped out of you, whether you're right or wrong. So if you look at the fear, we start shutting down in the organization. And double standards. Now, I'm sure we've all experienced some double standards. If you look at the double standards, there's nothing really more disheartening in an organization when one person or one department's being held accountable for something and the other department or other employees aren't. And a double standard could literally be the fact that I'm coming in late and my coworker's not having to come. They come in whenever the heck they want to, and basically I'm the one that's getting dumped on. I'm the one that is coming in late and I'm getting reprimanded, while there's another one in another department that happens to have a little better relationship with the manager or their coworkers, That's not being held accountable. So not being held accountable starts creating double standards. It's like, where do you stop and where do you start? It's like having that salesman complete that paperwork. Okay, well now we don't get the top salesman to do the paperwork because they're now holding us hostage, which we'll get to a little later on. But in that, what they're going to say is that if you make me fill out my paperwork, basically I'm going to leave and go to another company. So what we do, we let that person get by without filling out the paperwork or out doing the call sheets. Well, what kind of tone does that set for the organization now when we have someone that's entry level coming into the sales program, or a medium sales level person? What is that saying? And then what I've really found is that when you start those double standards, it's hard to turn them on and turn them off. So then, in effect, that becomes a part of the organizational structure and the organizational informal structure. So if we're looking at the holding hostage the employees. Now this was another interesting thing. I want you to think about holding hostage. We all have those folks in the organization that says, hey, if you make me go to that training class, we're going to lose all our customers. If you make me fill out that work order or purchase order, basically what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go to the other organization. If you make me participate in this quality program or this training program or this re-engineering program or this ISO program, I'm out of here. And I'm the only one that knows what's going on in my particular job. So what has happened, because we need that particular person that has learned how to hold us hostage, we've allowed him, and he starts manipulating his co-workers, then he starts manipulating either their manager or the manager manipulating the co-worker. And that's where we're talking about the next one, is holding hostage the management. I have been in a ton of places, and that fella has usually been in that company for a minimum of 8 years. The organization has grown. Nobody really knows what that person is doing. All of a sudden, they're kind of doing their own deal. No one really knows who they report to. No one really knows that, what that person does. And then, but we know we're getting the product or the service out the door. So we're like, oh, if he goes, this whole place is going to shut down. So again, we've got in a part, we have management that will hold us hostage. Or they will say, if you don't like it, hit the highway. Now, has that fixed anything? So if you look at it, holding hostage now the company. Hey, if you guys don't do it this way, we're going to shut down this facility and we're going to relocate it all back to our one plant, wherever it is. So what we're looking at there, how we can hold hostage. And there's nothing more insulting internally within an organization than holding hostage. And look at it. You will have those people that have learned how to manipulate the informal organization, the informal structure, their informal-based work centers to hold us all hostage. And they're masters at it. And because we're all saying, hey, it's hard to get employees. What if we lose this? What if we do this? They've got us dancing around on our tiptoes, making sure that we're keeping them happy. And we're focusing on everything else but our good employees. Next is change is fear. Now, this is kind of an interesting thing when we're talking about change is fear. We're going, how much change creates fear? We're saying that change, no matter how big or how little, is fear. So the change and the problem, what happens with a lot of the change or a lot of the stuff in an organization, I just experienced one that went to one particular department because they were told that's where they were having some problems. So what happened, they just went in there and started looking around and saying, hey, well, how are we doing business here? We're immediately, because of the fear, which when there's a high degree of fear, there's not much trust. And so what happened was now, that one department, it got out into the news and into the media saying that there's a big problem in this department. And they came to me and said, well, Bruce, how in the world? I said, well, that's the reason when we go into an organization, we have to have everybody participating in that change or in that infrastructuring are in that base skills, because when you start going throughout an organization and picking out this department or that one, change is fear, and they get very defensive. So when you're looking at change, it's so much easier to stay the same than it is to change, and it's really because the employees don't trust. If you step back and look at it, look at all the stuff. It's not just what we're battling with fear internally within the organization, but it's external. You know, earlier we talked about the personalities. What are those six, what's the workplace profile? Well, if you look at that, one of them was personality. So if you look at an employee that has usually had a bad relationship at their other work, what they are doing is that they're now bringing it to your organization. So we can say we're the best guys in the world until we prove that, and consistency promotes truth, that promotes trust, is that there's going to be fear. So they're not secure with the organization. So it's not just that we're battling internally this change or this fear, but we're also battling all the other external influences. I don't know how many of y'all have opened up a paper or turned the news on lately, but if you look at it, there's a story in a book called 7 Negatives to Every One Positive. And we'll remember 7 negatives for we will 1 positive. So not only are we having issues at work, interpersonal issues with co-workers or with management, but we're also having and constantly being reinforced out in the media, which is, whether anybody wants to admit it, is the biggest influence directly or indirectly in most of our lives, whether it's radio, whether it's TV, whether it's print. So pick up the newspaper. Look and see out of the front page how many are positive stories. I guarantee you they're going to report every negative thing known to man. We call it police blotter reporting. So here I am at work and at home, and I don't know about any of you, but if any of y'all are married, probably y'all have had some problems at home. So does that affect what we're doing? Yes, it does. So if you look at here, this negative stuff that's happening outside of the workplace is also affecting us. And it's also affecting us issues that we're bringing from our childhood. We want to call it, and what we call it is our sack of rocks. Well, the issue is that here this person has had these issues in their childhood. Well, I've always asked, where does that bully in school on the playgrounds end up? Well, they end up in the workplace. Now, the workplace, we have to deal with it. So if you look at the fear, and fear is change, is that we're battling a lot of other issues other than what's internally. So our people are bringing these things to work with them. And it was really strange what I realized a lot of the times in these negotiations, a lot of the issues, or what we perceived the problems were, had nothing to do with what we call the deal on the table. It had to do with all the stuff under the table. And a lot of them were the fear issues, and a lot of them were the fear and the insecurities. And a lot of those insecurities are what we're bringing from other jobs, other workers, positive or mainly negative reinforcement daily. So these are all the issues that we're dealing with. So change is fear. Insecurity with self and job. When there's fear in an organization, and what's happened, we're constantly hearing of organizations downsizing, outsourcing, laying off employees, cutting benefits, and we're saying here that in itself, whether our company has done it or not, all of a sudden I'm starting to feel a little insecure with what's happening. Then if I'm battling other issues that I'm bringing with me from the home, if I have a rocky relationship at home, or I've done something mean to make everybody mad at me, in effect we become fearful, that in fact we become insecure with ourselves and with our job. We really don't know who or what to trust. And we're saying here that with the fear, we take it home with us. And that's the issues that we're trying to bring, that if we can identify all these negative traits that fear bring on and turn them around into a positive through affirmations, which we'll talk about later, is that it's not only going to improve the work, but also improve our home life. And it says here, churning management. Man, that's one of the tough things you get out there. I've been in so many companies that they're constantly turning. The employees are looking up at the top and they're going, oh man, that's great. Said, we got a new guy, he really seems great. It takes us a year or 2 years to literally start getting an idea of what that person wants or starting to feel settled in. And then what happens when that person turns, or we call churning management, basically every 2 to 3 years, that leaves a devastating effect on your organization. So we're going, okay, now what does that person want? Am I doing what's right? Will they like me? So you think, well, we'll keep the old management team fresh and keep bringing new people in and this and this. But every time we do that creates fear, because when there's fear, we're constantly stepping back, what we call jockeying for a position, and wondering what's next. Then we're looking at churning employees. That's basically if we have no loyalty to our employees and we're looking at them only as a line item, and that we're looking at, okay, our costs are a little out of hand or our profit hadn't met this, let's lay them off. That's what happens when we're churning employees. And then all of a sudden you think, I'm the guy sitting next to the one that just left, or they outsource my base work center, or they outsource my job. And that's a whole nother issue. But then, am I the next one to go? And then we're going informal corporate structure. You know, that's really a powerful statement there. When there's fear in an organization, the informal structure, what we find is, number one, having to do with the written procedure and all that, of what we talked about, formalizing how we're doing business. But we have really an informal corporate structure, is that I've learned how that either I've got that person's ear, that's our boss, or the department head, I worked with him, and I kind of let it known that I have the ear of the person at top, or I can get certain things done. That starts creating what we call an informal structure. And when there's fear, we're not going to question it or we're not going to challenge it. And those ones that, the 1% that are manipulating it, have learned to use that to their advantage. And then in effect, not only does it become fearful, it becomes very frustrating, because what you see, the manipulation that starts going on, and in the informal corporate structure, it's kind of, yeah, you're supposed to report to me, you kind of do, you kind of don't. So then I'm now questioning, do I go here to whoever I think I'm supposed to report to, or to report here? And we call it, we get the tar whipped out of us no matter what in the world that we do. Then we're saying the power structure manipulation. The power structure manipulation in an informal organization with fear is that there's masters internally within the organization of just making everybody else's life miserable. And what's interesting, we all know who they are. We all know who those problem employees are. We all know who that 1% is. We all know who that 1% affecting 5% that affect 20%. When there's fear in the organization, we're not going to hold them accountable. We're just going to let it go, and hopefully that doesn't land over here. So when we're having the power structure manipulation in an informal and fear, I am now able to manipulate my implied powers, my implied job. I'm able to dump off my work. I'm able to kind of make you do things that I don't want to, and I'm thinking I got to do it because he's over at the boss's house doing tennis lessons or something. So I'm going, well, he's real tight with the boss. Without a clear base work center, without a clear system, and with fear, I'm not going to hold that thing accountable. I'm just going to step back from it, and I'm going to try to stay away from it. So if you look at what we're talking about, there's a lot of things that, just what we've talked about in these first few things, that are getting us really inefficient internally within the organization. And we're saying by formalizing how we're doing business, we're not saying we're all going to have to work 100, almost all of us now are working 50 hours a week. How many here have really turned the light off and we're going, okay, I got all the work done, it'll never all be done. But these 4 barriers that make it either that we can live with it or can't live with it. We're looking at departmental walls and job divisions. It's really interesting with this fear when we're looking at the departmental walls. And that is, a departmental wall problem is that when there's fear, is that literally I go, hey, I need this work order, I need this purchase order, I need whatever it is in the organization, and it happens to be I need it from the other department. If there's fear within an organization, and there's a lot of other things that start happening. We start creating profit centers, we start creating incentives and bonuses, and it's not the answer. None of that stuff's ever really worked long term. If it has, it's been very short term, and a lot of those guys that had all these incentive and investment and bonuses, they're no longer in business. So if you look at these departmental walls, when there's fear, I can't walk over to that department and say, this is what I need. What happens is, if I hold you accountable or your department accountable, you're going to go, ooh, I remember that. Next time, you're going to get what you need from me about a week later. And so what happens, that will teach you. And so as the departmental walls and the fear grow, is that now you're looking at how we're doing business. Man, we're just wasting a ton of time here. And then the job division, we just start splitting the organization. It's like we go into separate pockets and we're all dug in. You stay over in your department, I'll stay over in mine, but you don't come over here. That's why it's so hard to get anything changed throughout the organization. Because of the fear in the departmental walls, last time I came to your department or to your base work center, remember, last time we saw somebody was because of a problem. And if you look at it, that's really how we do. When there's fear, we're reactive to the thing. So there's departmental walls and job divisions. So literally nothing's flowing through the organization. We're having to rip, pull, outmaneuver, and do everything but address the issues and get the product out the door. Let's look at mental and physical intimidation when there's fear in an organization. And that's an interesting thing. I know a lot of y'all out there are going mental and physical intimidation. The mental intimidation is what we were kind of talking about, of being able and saying things mentally that intimidate our people. We'll say, hey, next time you do that, I'm not sure if I'm going to be good to you on your review. The physical intimidation is that because I'm a bigger guy than you are, I physically am going to intimidate my coworkers. And believe it or not, in these day and times in these United States, this stuff still exists. And when there's fear, we've learned to use our mental and our physical intimidation, mainly by the 1%, that we've learned to manipulate our coworkers and our organization. And when you have fear, you have basically unhappy employees. How can an employee be happy? What is there to be happy about? I'm going to work, I'm insecure, I don't know if I'm going to have a job tomorrow. The person, I'm sitting here busting my rear end every day, and that person there is taking Fridays off. They're not getting held accountable. They're doing sloppy work. I'm having to take their work. So I guarantee you, we have unhappy employees. It's interesting. If you go out, now I haven't been to one in a long time, but like they used to call them FACs or happy hour on a Friday. You go out, what are people talking about? They're usually talking about things at work, and they're usually not the positive things. They're usually the things that are frustrating to our employees. So in effect, we have unhappy employees. My question to you is, how productive is an unhappy employee? Not very productive. When the fear cage paralyzes the organization. And when the fear, and what we're saying is that literally it's like we're in a cage, and we call it the fear cage. And when there's the fear at its greatest, we become very reactive. It kind of reminds me like we stick our hand out to fix something and we get our hand slapped. So the fear cage, the easiest thing to do is to stay in that fear cage, and that is stay here, and we become what we call very reactive to the organization. I'm not going to stick my hand out there until I'm told to stick my hand out there. So in effect, the fear cage, I'm staying inside this fear. I've become very reactive to the organization. I was proactive one time, and it usually takes 8 months for us to beat a new employee into what we call submission. We call them that we'll beat the enthusiasm out of them, because everybody noticed. And my wife made this clear to me. She goes, Bruce, think about it. Everybody that goes to work at a company, their first 8 months or they're all bubbly, they're all excited, they're all trying and doing things, but pretty soon with the 4 barriers, they're beat into submission. So if you look at that, what we're talking about with the fear, the informal organizational structure and all this stuff, that's why we're saying the larger the organization, the more entrenched the 4 barriers. The longer the organization has been in business, the more entrenched the 4 barriers are. The easiest companies for us to do are startup companies, because the entrepreneur that's starting them up and they're growing like a weed, man, they just go, hey, what's it going to cost? What's it going to do? When's it going to be done? And let's go for it. And it was really interesting. A friend of mine that I met through business was Steve Yamaguchi, one of the founders of Quantum Healthcare. Basically, they grew from 4 folks that started a business to within I think it was 4 to 5 years, they ended up $500 million in sales and about 2,000 employees. And I met Steve. Everybody that worked for Steve, now as Steve left, they went public, they went through the whole thing, and that's a whole nother story, is that what happened, all of them still want to work for Steve. Steve was what we call that integrity of that founder. That's why they had business. That's why people enjoyed working for him. And Steve said, what's really weird is that the company that we left, because we're saying most of the entrepreneurs that start companies were doing the same thing at another company, and the company wouldn't listen to them, and they were doing everything anyway, so they ended up just doing it themselves. And so what happened was, Steve said that when we were growing, and we were growing at a 20 to 30% clip, that made it where they couldn't finance that growth, because when you're growing at 30%, it's hard to finance it internally. When you're growing at a 15 to 20%, you're throwing cash and bodies at it. And that's kind of what happened when we first started, is that we had been growing at 15 to 20% clip. It flattened out and the sales dropped, then all the rocks started showing. Steve says when we were at our best is when we were growing. The first 4 years is that we needed everybody. So we really didn't, no one had fear. We were encouraging them, and they did. They wrote a great mission statement, and they lived by that mission statement. They gave the power to everybody in that organization that, hey, if this is an issue, go back to your mission statement and you make that decision. Well, they soon fell into the trap. He's going, Bruce, when we were growing, we needed everybody, and everybody was doing and participating. But then we got out, sales started slowing down from that 30, 20% to maybe 10 or 12. He says, then it's like we kind of took a breath and said, okay, let's start putting this structure. And then because there's a lot of things starting to go wrong as the organization gets big, we start having these little problems. And before you know it, he going, you know, we locked it all down. And he goes, we did exactly that. He goes, we shut down the organization. When we had no fear was when we were growing, and we allowed our employees the responsibility of their job. So if you look at the fear cage, paralyzing the organization. Now this is another interesting thing, the 19%. If you look at that, what are we talking about, the 19%? Really, the 19% is that 1% internally within an organization is a bad employee. I don't care what you do. Every day that person comes to work, they've got a bad attitude, they're always unhappy, and they're going to make your life miserable. So you can give them a sack of sugar and they're going to complain about it. So you look at the 1%, they affect 4% of the co-workers with the same negative characteristics. And we found this out statistically, is that 1% affects 4 with the same negative characteristics. Now we've discovered that 1% has a lot of issues internally, having to do with a lot of insecurities, and a lot of that they're bringing back from their childhood. And so what has happened, that 1%, when there's fear, then affects 4% that affect 20% of the organization with negative characteristics. That's how bad that 1% is internally within the organization. So really, we're messing around and screwing up 19% of our workforce. Now the other 15% will not have all the same negative characteristics, but they might have 1 out of like 5. The 1% will have all 5 bad characteristics. Then in a sense, then they affect the 4 with the same characteristics. Then this 5% is affecting the other 15% with maybe 1 of those 5 traits. So what happens when there's fear in an organization, we can't step up and hold that stuff accountable. And not only because of the fear, but because of the other barriers that are involved. So when there's fear, that 1% in an informal organization and structure runs rampant. That person is going from job to job, department to department, internally within that organization, manipulating its co-workers, and you never guess who the one that squeals the loudest when we start doing something that starts touching and moving accountability through the organization. It's the 1%. And they've learned how to manipulate the informal organization and how to manipulate through the fear in the organization. And so what happens is they know who to see, what to say, when to say it. They know when the boss is going to walk by the water cooler. They know just what to say to get them fired up, and they're master manipulators. And what they'll do is that they'll drop those few things that sound logical and sound right, but they've left out a few parts. Then all of a sudden I go off half-cocked and said, hey, that's it. You guys need to get, and the employees have done nothing wrong. So the 1% that affect 5% that affect 20% of the organization in a negative characteristic. And when there's fear, these folks are running rampant. And it's interesting. Mark Aiken, one of the city managers of one of the companies we were in, basically said, it's really interesting, Bruce, we spend so much time in an organization trying to make the 1% happy. And he is saying, he goes, Bruce, what y'all were saying is that the 1% will take care of themselves, and statistically they have. Why don't we focus on the 99% that are doing it right? So instead what we're doing is that, think of this, we have a tendency to focus and try to keep the 1% happy. And then we're not even dealing with the 99% that are doing it right. So in turn, this 1% knows what to say, when to say it the loudest, plant all these negative things, because there's actually, this is kind of an interesting thing that's really kind of disheartening to, with the 1%. They don't have a problem even just a bald-faced lie. Most of us, we get sweaty palms if we're even stretching a truth. Well, if you look at, there's some people that don't have a problem. Those guys are destructive internally. This is what's frustrating us internally within the organization. I'm a good person, I'm working hard. That person there is manipulating the system, manipulating the boss, manipulating the co-worker, and they're the first ones to scream that everybody else is screwing the company. And we listen to them, so we're trying to make them happy. Think of that. That we're running and jumping through hoops trying to make them happy. And what we've discovered, and what Mark Aiken said, he goes, Bruce, you're saying that these people will never be happy. They won't. There is absolutely nothing you can do to make them happy. They might be happy for a day, but soon we call that cloud of misery. They go from one tragedy to one tragedy to the next continually through the organization. And when you have fear in the organization, it's an interesting comment. It says, I have no fear. Now where that one came from, we were in a meeting and we actually had one of these folks that were beating their chest that they're the most giving, the most compassionate, and I think they sincerely believed that. And they're the ones that stand up and go, hey, I ain't got no fear. But it was interesting. One of the department heads across goes, but do people fear you? Now that's interesting. Now think about that. I'm here leading the organization or as a co-worker. I have no fear, but do others fear me? And seeing when there's that fear in the organization, a lot of times we're not going to really resolve the issues because we're just never even going to address those things. And so if you look at, it's really, we call it reactive. We kind of talked about that in the fear cage, but the reactive. When there's fear in an organization, the organization literally stops being progressive. They stop getting out there and making things happen. They become very reactive. That is that I'm sitting here because last time I tried, last time I stepped forward, last time I showed empathy or compassion or care for the customer or for myself or for my coworker, I got my hand slapped. So the greater the fear, the more reactive the organization comes. It's literally, you know, I get a lot of managers come to me and say, man, they don't care, they don't do this. I have to pull them by. I have to put their hand on the computer thing to push that button. That's how. Well, there's a lot of issues, and a lot of it really has to do with the fear. And that if you really look at it, if I could go out and make an energy or an effort toward whatever it is, whether it's our internal, external, customer, and supplier, and I had no fear that I was going to get the tar whipped out of me, you would ignite that. And that's what one of the things Steve Yamaguchi saw in our book. He goes, yeah, when we were growing, we had no fear, and people could just get out and make it happen. They had that responsibility. And that was exciting, because what happened was when we're able to contribute to the job and to the workplace, it feels like we belong, and it's exciting and it's challenging to go to work. So if you look at what-ifing, we call that what-ifing the deal to death. And when there's fear, we're going to do business as usual. We're not going to venture out, and we're going to have those folks sitting on the sideline, what we call it, going and telling, what if the market drops? What if it rains in China? What if the sea drops 7 feet? And we'll hear all these what-if extremes, because I don't want to make the decision. When there's fear, I am just wanting to stay status quo. I am not going to step out, and I am not going to do something that might put me or my job in jeopardy. I don't care what anybody says. I've heard those folks beat their chest and say, hey, I had a job before I had this one. Man, it's really tough. Even if it's for the better, it's really tough to leave an organization. It's really tough to get out there and try to do. So the person that's saying, I had another job, is usually the one that is probably the most fearful in the organization, and also are the most frustrated. And this is interesting, this next one, we call it bitchitis. And if y'all can imagine what in the world that means, I'm not even sure if it's a real word or not, but we did it. And the story is talking about in the book is that with that fear and with that 1% that's manipulating the 20%, is that all we do is complain. No matter what the organization is doing, it's not right. They're screwing everybody, they're screwing their customer, they're screwing each other, I'm never happy. And what you see is that we're saying that's contagious. That negative attitude, that complaining is contagious. It works throughout the organization like a cancer. Before you know it, and when there's fear, all we're doing is talking negative about one another, about ourselves, and about the organization. And with this negative, what we call negative rap, is that we don't know when to shut it down. What we end up doing is that we start taking it home with us. And then all of a sudden we're sitting around the dinner table, and all we're doing is getting on my son or my daughter going, hey, you didn't do this, you didn't get an A, you didn't get a B, and then all of a sudden all I'm doing is complaining, and all of a sudden all we're doing is starting to shut down the organization. And because of the fear is that we try to vent, and that person that has learned, or that the one that's always negative, we can't hold them accountable because they've really learned how to manipulate the systems internally, or the lack of formal systems internally within the organization. We call this next one sitting on the sidelines. And when there's fear, no one in the organization is going to step up. You're going to see them all squirming around in the boardroom, all squirming around in production meeting, all squirming around in strategic planning meetings, all squirming around when we have project management meetings, all when we're having problem solving or task team, is that when we're sitting on the sidelines and when there's fear, I am not going to make a commitment. I am not going to step outside of my comfort zone. And remember, when there's fear, there's no comfort. So the best way for me to survive in this organization is really to do nothing and become very reactive. Literally just sit here with my hands in my pocket and wait for you to tell me to do what you want me to do for my job. So when there's fear and sitting on the sidelines, we got folks that just start sitting on the sideline, again becoming very reactive. Or in effect, we have that 1% that's negative, that's sitting on the sideline and is telling us every reason in the world why that deal won't make, or every reason in the world why whatever we're doing is not wrong. They never get involved. I want y'all to really go back and look at these people in the organization. We call them the deal killers. Sorry, the accent there. Is that the deal killers will sit on the sidelines, sit around the table, and defeat anything that the organization is doing. From the negative thing is, it's just safer to do that. And then the reactive part of it is that sitting on the sidelines, we now start shutting down, and again, the 1% that we're trying to make change in the organization, they're going to go up to the boss and go, you know, man, if we put this quality program in, if we do this re-engineering, if we do this leadership training, if we do this ISO certification, if we do this needs analysis, man, the whole place is going to go nuts. Man, we're going to lose every customer we had. And what you're going to see is that you'll see that person sitting on the sidelines, never contributing, and I want everybody here to back up and look at this sitting on the sidelines. You'll see the same people. And when there's fear, we're all sitting around the conference table, and that owner in his heart, that CEO, that department head, that frontline supervisor really wants the input, but when there's fear, we're afraid where it's going to come and get us. So we start shutting down. And hands-on management. Now this is an interesting thing here when we're talking about hands-on management. The hands-on management is that when there's fear, the last time, not only in an informal organization, because remember what we talked about, we can't just look at fear and disregard the communication, the written procedure, and the training. See, and this is what you're going to see as this thing evolves here, the understanding of how these four are interacting. We're saying here that the hands-on management is the fact last time I delegated something, it went sideways. So now when there's fear, I feel very uncomfortable about delegating, and especially when there's no written communication, no written procedure, and have no training. I've got whatever this issue is, I'm going to throw it out on the floor. Chances are that deal's going to go sideways. And that's why you see a lot of management working day and night. They're usually underpaid, overstressed, and overworked. They have no systems there to support them. They have no direction. And when there's fear in an organization, they're trying to do the deal themselves. And this is another interesting thing. As our management evolves, most of us never went to a management school, much less a management on how to do that particular job. Most management evolves because they're good problem solvers, because they know how to fix things. They know how that we've been able to delegate, they followed through, they made it happen. So in effect, they're good problem solvers, so they rise up in the organization, and all of a sudden they're a manager with no systems in place. It's like, I think, our easiest example of preventive maintenance. We have a maintenance worker that's really good, been there forever, so we end up making him a maintenance manager. Well, that lasts for just about 2 weeks. We'll find that person out on the floor again, and the reason he's out on the floor is for the fact that what has happened is that he feels more secure or comfortable with hands-on because he knows how to do that. He can't manage because he doesn't have a system. So if you look at this, the hands-on management, we have that when there's fear, the easiest and the safest way to go is to keep my hands on it. I'm not going to delegate it because last time I did, I got the tar whipped out of me. Letting go. Another thing when there's fear, it's like prying to let go in the organization because we don't trust. We don't trust all the stuff that could happen in this change, and when there's fear, I'm not going to let go. It's hard. And we have some habits that we take whatever it is, we fix it and redo it, and then send it back out. And what we're talking about here is that the fear, it's hard to let go. And if you look at the fear, there's absolutely no trust or minimum trust. Because every time we go somewhere, everybody goes, oh, here's another one of these. This thing's going to last about a week. Okay, last time we did this, I worked day and night and on weekends, and then they took it once we hit a tough point, then they dropped the training or the program. So if you look at it, it's hard internally, we don't have the trust. With the fear, we now become what we call followers. The organization now starts, where we had leadership and people that were stepping out, we now start settling down to followers. Because a leader, to get a leadership position, if they're going to lead in their sphere, and if I step out, I got a chance of getting the tar whipped out of me. So I'm going to just stay and be a follower. Then it says, what's interesting, what do you want to hear? I've actually been in meetings where the employees are trying to get their boss to tell them exactly what they want to say because of the fear. And then we walk out the room, we go, hey, we got buy-off from everybody. You didn't get buy-off, you got everybody to approve because of the fear of what they thought that you wanted. So the new ideas, the freshness in the organization becomes stale. Status quo. When there's fear, this is what we're talking about, the status quo. The status quo, keep business like it is. Whether it's right or it's wrong, it's easier to keep doing and than to change the way that we're doing business. And I've seen them stay the same until we're almost bankrupt, because it's safer to just keep doing it until we have a reason and a change. And we're saying most of the change has to happen is when force change. And we're saying let's be proactive. And it's not going to happen overnight because of the fear. That's why we do nothing but minimum 2 years. If you think anything's going to change, it ain't. And it's interesting, we call it an affirmation. We're saying to change a habit takes 8 or 9 months. And the story in the book talks about affirmation. Basically is that when we were kids, we'd go to town. There were 3 of us boys, 8, 6, and 5. Well, my mama would take us to town and she'd go, hey, you boys don't spit on the sidewalk. We lived out in Chickasaw, Alabama. We'd come into town and she'd go, well, what do you think the little boys are going to do when their mama tells them something? They do it, not to do it. So she'd pop us on back of the head, and we're saying that's affirmation. So now we're getting reinforced not to spit on the sidewalk. Well, that, they said, takes 8 or 9 months of constantly reinforcing it for it to become a habit. So if it's going to take me 9 months to keep from spitting on the sidewalk, how in the world are we going to change an organization in a year, in a quarter, in 6 months, in 1 month? You're not. That's why all this stuff don't work. We got to be patient. So if we look at the stress, status quo. The status quo will stay the same. The stress, when there's fear, everything becomes stressful. We're stressing on whether we should do it, shouldn't do it, new product, old product, whatever you want to call it. Then let's look at how do we address the fear. And these are literally how we did it. We go in and we get a letter of commitment from the CEO. And I was on a plane with a bunch of folks coming back from Atlanta. They had all went about 80 of them up to this new program, and they're going, well, yeah, the guy at the top supports it. No one's ever seen him. Nothing's ever changed, and all they're doing is just getting the tar whipped out of them. We're saying that we have to have a letter of commitment from the president, CEO. We have to adhere to the base values, the 2 rules. We have to address the quality issues. And remember, the quality issues can be people, personality, or process. Probus Management. Probus is a Latin word for honesty and integrity. We all have to manage that way. This is how we address the fear. We have to walk the walk and talk the talk. It sounds old, but that's what we've got to do. Quality will create new jobs. Consistency promotes truth, that promotes trust. We have to believe in the commitment to quality, and that the quality is going to take time, and the change is going to take time. All employees have to be involved going in the same direction. We have to have patience. It's going to take time. Positive attitude, positive results. Faith of the 99%. We have to have faith that it's going to work. If you look at that, the 24-month minimum commitment to anything that you're going to do in regards to change, in regards to building business infrastructure, in regard to formalizing how you're doing business is going to take a minimum of 24 months because your employees ain't going to believe it. They're not going to trust. Not taking it personal, attacking the issues, not the person or the organization. We're saying attack us, attack the 4 barriers, but don't attack each other. And what we're saying is that we have to look at the issues and not our people. See the results. If you look at consistency that promotes truth, that's interesting. Then leadership through the organization, truth equals trust because we've been consistent, that promotes truth, that promotes trust. So we start trusting. That's why it takes a minimum of 12 to 16 months before your employees ever start even thinking you're serious. We have to respect one another and of our co-workers. And the results, we're able to ask open and honest questions and get open and honest answers. Out of this, we become secure with leadership. We have a free flow of information, meaning we can go throughout the organization literally and ask any question and get an open and honest answer. We feel a part of the organization. We have self-worth, feeling good about ourselves as we start reducing the fear, and that I belong, where our input is of value. If you look at page number 13, we're going to go into the story trust. If you look at trust, trust cannot be bought. It has to be earned day in and day out by every employee within the organization. Trust is the foundation of change. That's why we resist change, because we don't trust the organization. We don't trust our co-workers. We're carrying all this other baggage along with us. So this story talks about here that we have to trust, not only in ourselves, but in our organization. If you look at now page 14, now this is interesting here. These are frequently asked questions or thoughts. My business is unique. It's not like the others. If you look at that, know your business is not unique. The 4 barriers apply. We're from cattle companies to high-tech companies, to computer cabling companies, to automotive companies, to colleges that we're structuring with the program, and to government. The 4 barriers are all the same. And your industry and your situation is no different. They might be to a greater or lesser degree. I have no fear. Our question is, but do people fear you? How does fear paralyze an organization? What we talked about, as the fear grows and is implanted, is that the organization then becomes very reactive, and we're paralyzing the organization. Does fear Does fear make us feel insecure? You darn right it does, because we're not trusting anything. Okay, let's wind this up and let's go down to number 13. Why is it important for all employees to manage, plan, schedule, and monitor, even if I'm not a manager? That's what we're talking about, the importance of these base skills. All of our employees internally within the organizations need these skills, what we call these base skills, for continuance and growth. We covered a lot of stuff today. We're going to be going over a lot of other in regards to our ABS program. So we'd like for everyone to kind of stay tuned, follow up with our other classes and other training, and really think about what we've talked about here today. And I want you to go back to work and look at and step back and look at these 4 barriers, how they're interacting with you. Thank you and have a good day.